Hands where I can see them. Stop reaching.
Officer, my hands are flat. I am reaching for nothing.
Step out now or I will remove you.
I know the color of the law better than you know your badge number.
On the car! Now!
The blinking red light of that body cam was recording the exact moment Officer Martin Kearney ended his career. He thought he was detaining a confused grandmother who would buckle under his shouting. He had no idea he was facing Eleanor Whitlock, a woman who spent 30 years as a high-profile federal prosecutor putting corrupt officials behind bars. Eleanor wasn't shaking. She wasn't pleading. She was mentally filing the lawsuit that was about to cost the city $3 million. She had argued before the Supreme Court, written the very legal manuals this officer was ignoring, and now she was about to become the most expensive mistake this department ever made. Before we break down the footage that cost this city millions, I have a question for you. Have you ever felt targeted during a routine stop? Drop your city and state in the comments. And if you're ready to see a masterclass in legal justice, hit that subscribe button right now. This takedown is legendary. The morning sun was bright as Eleanor Whitlock drove down the main city road. She was on her way to a big legal meeting, feeling good about the day ahead. Eleanor was 62 years old and had spent her whole life working with the law. She was a former federal prosecutor, which meant she spent many years making sure people followed the rules. She was always very careful to be a good citizen. As she drove, she checked her mirrors and saw blue and red lights flashing behind her. Her heart skipped a beat, but she did not panic. She knew exactly what to do. She looked for a safe spot to stop and pulled over right away into a well-lit area, near a traffic light. Eleanor wanted to make sure everything went smoothly. She rolled down her window and turned off her engine. Then she placed both of her hands flat on the steering wheel where they were easy to see. She sat very still and waited. She knew that keeping her hands visible was the best way to show she was not a threat. She watched in her side mirror as Officer Martin Kearney stepped out of his patrol car. He looked very tense and serious as he walked toward her. Eleanor took a deep breath and prepared to be as polite as possible, hoping this was just a simple mistake. Officer Kearney did not start the talk with a friendly hello. Instead, he walked up to Eleanor's window with a look of anger on his face. He reached for his belt and stood very close to her door. Before she could even say a word, he started shouting at her to show him her license and insurance. His voice was loud and mean. Eleanor tried to stay calm and speak softly. She started to explain that her license was in her purse on the passenger seat, but Kearney would not let her finish. Every time she tried to talk, he barked over her, telling her to stop making excuses and just do what he said. It felt like a trap. If she moved to grab her purse, he might think she was reaching for a weapon. If she sat still, he would say she was not following orders. Kearney was acting like she was a dangerous criminal instead of a grandmother on her way to work. His face was red, and he kept gesturing with his hands in an aggressive way. He was creating a no-win situation where nothing Eleanor did seemed right to him. Eleanor realized that this officer was not interested in the truth. He only wanted to show that he was in charge. She kept her hands on the wheel, her eyes steady, and her mind racing to remember every detail of this strange encounter. The situation got much worse very quickly. Officer Kearney seemed to lose his patience completely. He reached down and grabbed the door handle, pulling Eleanor's door open with a loud thud. He ordered her to get out of the car right now. Eleanor moved slowly and carefully. She did not want to give him any reason to use force. She stepped out onto the pavement, keeping her chin up and her expression calm. She was trying to show him that she was not afraid, but she was also not resisting him at all. As soon as she was out of the car, Kearney moved behind her. Even though Eleanor was standing perfectly still, he grabbed her right arm with a very tight grip. He twisted her behind her back and shoved her against the side of her black sedan. Eleanor felt a sharp pain in her shoulder as her chest hit the cold metal of the car. Kearney was using much more force than he needed for a simple traffic stop. He was acting as if he had caught a runaway outlaw. Eleanor did not scream or fight back. She knew that physical resistance would only lead to more pain. Instead, she leaned into the car, closed her eyes for a second, and focused on her breathing knowing that this was all a terrible mistake on the officer's part, while Eleanor was pinned against her car. She noticed the small black device on Officer Kearney's chest. It was his body cam, and she could see a tiny light blinking on it. She knew that this little camera was her most important witness. She turned her head slightly so she was looking right into the lens. Her voice did not shake as she began to speak in a very clear and professional tone. She stated her full name, Eleanor Whitlock, and told the camera exactly what was happening. She explained that she was a former federal prosecutor and that her constitutional rights were being violated. She called out the Fourth Amendment, which protects people from unfair searches and arrests. Kearney scoffed and told her he didn't care who she was or what she knew. He kept his weight pressed against her, trying to make her feel small. But Eleanor felt strong because she knew the camera was recording his every move and every word. She was the silent witness to her own struggle. She wanted to make sure that anyone who watched the video later would see a calm woman being bullied by a man with a badge. She stood as tall as she could, even with her arm twisted, and continued to state the facts of the law as if she were already in a courtroom. The sound of more sirens filled the air as two more police cars pulled up to the scene. Eleanor hoped that the new officers would see what was really happening and tell Kearney to stop. But when the other officers stepped out, they did not ask any questions. They saw Kearney holding an older woman against a car and assumed he was doing the right thing. Kearney shouted to them that Eleanor was being belligerent and was not following his orders. The new officers took his word for it without even looking at Eleanor's calm face or her visible hands. Instead of helping to calm things down, the backup officers joined in. They surrounded Eleanor, making her feel trapped. One of them held her other arm, while Kearney pulled out his metal handcuffs. They acted like the 62-year-old woman was a huge threat to the city. None of them noticed how professional she looked in her gray blazer or how composed she remained. They only saw what they wanted to see. Eleanor realized that the whole system was following Kearney's lead, even though it was all based on a lie. She felt a deep sadness for the city, but her resolve only grew stronger. She would not let them win. After being handcuffed, Eleanor was taken to the police station. She was led into a cold, gray room for booking. This is where they take your picture and fingerprints. Even though she was being treated like a criminal, Eleanor did not lose her cool. She sat on a hard bench and watched everything with sharp eyes. She began to memorize the names on the badges of every person she saw. She watched the clock and noted exactly what time things were happening. She asked to speak to a supervisor and to use her phone, but the officers just ignored her as if she weren't there. She remained very quiet and composed. She did not yell or cry. She knew that any sign of anger would be used against her later. She was like a student taking a test, focusing only on the details. She noticed who was being mean and who was just following orders. She felt the weight of the handcuffs on her wrists, but she didn't let them break her spirit. She was already building her case in her head. She knew that she had the truth on her side, and she was prepared to wait as long as it took to get justice. She was no longer just a victim. She was a witness gathering evidence for the fight of her life. Lillian, Perro sat in her home office when her phone finally rang. It was her mother, Eleanor. Lillian was 35 years old and worked as a very smart investigative journalist. She was used to finding out the truth about big stories, but she never expected her own mother to be the news. When she heard Eleanor's calm but tired voice coming from the police station, Lillian did not panic or cry. Instead, her mind went straight to work. She was a determined and curious woman with medium-length hair, and she always wore professional clothes like a neat blouse and blazer. Lillian knew exactly what to do to protect her mother. She pressed a button to start recording the phone call right away. She listened carefully as Eleanor explained how Officer Kearney had treated her during the traffic stop. Lillian took quick notes, her eyes alert and focused. She knew that time was very important. Even before the call ended, she was already typing up a formal request to get the bodycam and dashcam records from the police department. Lillian felt a mix of anger and love. She was fiercely supportive of her mother and had spent her career advocating for what is right. She knew that if the police tried to hide what happened, she would be the one to expose them. She told Eleanor to stay strong and stay quiet. Lillian promised that she was going to turn this dark moment into a light that everyone in the city would see. As she hung up, she wasn't just a worried daughter anymore. She was an investigator on a mission to get justice for Eleanor Whitlock. Lillian Harrow did not waste a single second. As an investigative journalist, she knew that the truth needed to be seen by everyone before the police could change the story. She reached out to a contact who had been standing nearby during the traffic stop and had caught the whole thing on a smartphone. When Lillian watched the grainy video of her mother, a dignified 62-year-old woman, being shoved against a car by a much younger and aggressive Officer Kearney, her heart burned with a mix of sadness and professional focus. She quickly shared the footage with her news network, and it went live that evening. Got the reaction from the public was like a massive storm. By the next morning, the video had millions of views online. People were outraged to see Eleanor Whitlock, who looked so calm and professional in her gray blazer, being treated so roughly. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side was a woman who had spent her life serving the law, and on the other was a man with a badge using his power to bully her. The news cycle was filled with images of the incident, and the city began to demand answers. Lillian watched from her office as the story took on a life of its own, knowing that the public pressure was exactly what they needed to make sure the police department couldn't sweep this under the rug. With the media storm swirling, Eleanor knew she needed the best legal mind in the city. That was when Tobias Renwick entered the picture. Tobias was a veteran civil rights advocate, 59 years old, with sharp eyes and a calm, intense way of speaking. He met Eleanor in a quiet office, surrounded by stacks of legal papers. As Eleanor told him the details of the stop, Tobias listened without interrupting, his silver-gray hair catching the light as he nodded. He didn't just see a traffic stop. He saw a masterclass in civil rights violations. Tobias looked over the notes Lillian had gathered and the bystander video. He realized that Officer Kearney had broken almost every rule in the book. From the way he escalated the tone of the conversation to the physical force he used on a non-threatening citizen, Kearney had acted like a rogue officer. Tobias leaned back in his chair and looked at Eleanor with a confident smile. He told her that this case was bigger than just one bad afternoon. It was a chance to hold the entire department accountable. He was ready to take the fight to the courtroom. And Eleanor knew she finally had a legal shark on her side who was just as determined as she was. A few days later, the official police incident report was finally released to the public. Tobias and Eleanor sat together to read what Officer Kearney had written about that day. According to the report, Eleanor had been uncontrollably angry and had even tried to strike the officer with her hand. Kearney claimed he only used force to protect himself from a dangerous situation. It was a complete work of fiction. Tobias didn't get angry when he read the lies. Instead, he actually smiled. Tobias knew something that Kearney seemingly forgot. The Bodycam was running the whole time. The written report was a trap that Kearney had built for himself. By claiming Eleanor was violent, Kearney had committed perjury, which means lying under oath. Tobias knew that once they got their hands on the actual Bodycam footage, Kearney's written words would be his undoing. The officer had tried to paint a picture of a belligerent woman to save his career, but he had actually provided Tobias with the perfect evidence to prove the department was acting in bad faith. The trap was set, and all they needed now was the video to spring it. Getting that video, however, turned out to be a major battle. When Tobias asked for the Bodycam footage, the police department started making excuses. They claimed the files were lost or that there were technical glitches that prevented them from opening the video. It was a classic move to hide the truth, but Tobias was not going to let them get away with it. He filed a subpoena, which is a legal order that forces someone to hand over evidence, and brought the fight to a pretrial hearing inside the courtroom. The city's lawyers tried to argue that the footage was private or didn't exist anymore. Tobias stood before the judge, his voice steady and powerful. He argued that the public's trust was at stake and that the glitches were far too convenient for a department under fire. He pointed out that Officer Kearney's own report was being questioned and that only the video could show the truth. The judge agreed with Tobias. She issued a stern warning to the police department and ordered them to turn over the full, unedited bodycam footage within 24 hours. The wall of silence was finally breaking down, and the truth was about to be seen by everyone. The room was very quiet as Tobias Renwick, Eleanor Whitlock, and Lillian Harrow sat down to watch the bodycam video for the first time. The police had finally handed it over after the judge ordered them to do so. On the screen, the footage was shaky and grainy, but the truth was as clear as day. The video showed exactly what happened from Officer Kearney's chest. It showed Eleanor's hands flat on the steering wheel, just as she had said. It recorded her polite voice and her calm explanation of her rights. The most shocking part was seeing Kearney's behavior. The video showed him shouting over her and pulling his door open before he even gave her a chance to move. When he grabbed Eleanor's arm and twisted it, the camera was so close that they could hear her pained gasp. There was no sign of Eleanor striking the officer or being belligerent. In fact, she looked like a statue of peace compared to Kearney's frantic, angry movements. Tobias watched the screen with a grim look, while Lillian held her mother's hand tightly. The tape did not lie. It proved that the police report was a total fabrication. They now had the smoking gun needed to win. Soon after the video was released to the legal teams, the city's lawyers reached out to Tobias. They knew the bodycam footage was a disaster for their case. They offered Eleanor a nuisance settlement of $500,000. It was a lot of money. But there was a catch. The offer came with a strict non-disclosure agreement, or an NDA. This meant Eleanor would have to take the money and then never speak about the case again. She would have to delete the videos and pretend the whole thing never happened. Tobias presented the offer to Eleanor, but he already knew what her answer would be. Eleanor did not hesitate for a second. She told Tobias that her dignity and the truth were not for sale. She wasn't fighting just for herself. She was fighting for every person who didn't have a law degree or a famous daughter to help them. She wanted a public trial so the whole world could see the misconduct. If we take the money and stay quiet, nothing changes, she said firmly. Tobias nodded, feeling proud to represent her. They sent a message back to the city. The case was going to trial. The day of the trial finally arrived, and the air in the courthouse felt electric. The hallways were packed with reporters, civil rights activists, and curious citizens who had followed the story online. Everyone wanted to see if the system would actually hold one of its own accountable. When the doors opened, the gallery filled up in minutes. Eleanor sat at the plaintiff's table in a sharp charcoal suit, looking every bit the professional she was. Across the aisle, Officer Kearney sat with his head down, looking much less confident than he did on the day of the arrest. The Honorable Delilah Farnsworth took the bench, and the room fell silent as she struck her gavel. She was a woman of great authority, and her presence made it clear that only the truth would be tolerated in her courtroom. Tobias Renwick stood up to give his opening statement. He spoke about the trust citizens place in the police and how that trust is shattered when an officer uses his badge as a weapon. He promised the jury they would see the real Eleanor Whitlock, not the criminal Kearney described in his report, but the woman who stood for the law even when the law was being used against her. The biggest moment of the trial came when Officer Kearney had to take the witness stand. Tobias Renwick walked toward him, holding a remote control for the large TV screen facing the jury. Tobias began to play the bodycam footage frame by frame. He would stop the video every few seconds and ask Kearney a question. "Is this the moment she struck you, officer?" Tobias asked as the screen showed Eleanor standing perfectly still. Kearney stumbled over his words, his face turning a bright shade of red dot as the video continued. Kearney's excuses began to crumble. He tried to say he felt threatened, but the video showed no threat at all. Tobias pointed out the contradictions between the video and the written report Kearney had filed. Under the intense pressure of the cross-examination, Kearney couldn't keep his story straight. He began to sweat and look at his lawyers for help, but there was none to be found. The jury watched with serious faces, realizing that they were watching an officer get caught in a lie in real time. By the time Kearney stepped down, his credibility was completely gone. After the closing arguments, the jury left the room to talk in private. Eleanor, Lillian, and Tobias moved into the quiet hallway to wait. The wait felt very long. Eleanor sat on a wooden bench, leaning forward with her hands clasped. She looked tired, but she did not look defeated. Lillian walked back and forth, using her phone to record short updates for the people following the story online. She could see that the whole world was waiting to hear the news. 2 hours passed, and the tension in the hallway grew thick. Even the lawyers for the city looked nervous. They kept checking their watches and whispering to each other. Every time a door opened, everyone jumped a little, wondering if it was time. Tobias stayed close to Eleanor, telling her that no matter what happened, they had already won by showing the truth to the public. Finally, a court officer stepped out and announced that the jury was ready. Eleanor took a deep breath, stood up straight, and walked back into the courtroom to face her fate. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop as the jury foreperson stood up to read the verdict. Eleanor held her breath and closed her eyes. The foreperson announced that the jury found Officer Kearney and the city guilty of violating Eleanor's civil rights. Then came the part that made the whole room gasp. The jury awarded Eleanor $3 million in damages. They also gave a special instruction that Officer Kearney must be formally disciplined for his actions and his lies. Eleanor felt a single tear run down her cheek as she finally exhaled. It wasn't about the money. It was about the relief of being believed. Beside her, Lillian let out a small cry of joy and hugged her mother tightly. Tobias clapped Eleanor on the back, a look of great pride on his face. Across the room, Officer Kearney sat with his head in his hands, finally facing the consequences of his choices. Judge Farnsworth struck her gavel one last time, ending the trial that had changed everything. Justice had been served, and the truth had won the day. The victory in the courtroom was just the beginning. In the months that followed, the city made a big change. They created a new rule called the Whitlock Rule. This rule made it much stricter for how officers must act during traffic stops and made it easier to punish those who lie on their reports. Eleanor's struggle had turned into a legacy that would protect people for many years to come. Officer Kearney was fired from the department, showing that no one is above the law. On a beautiful, sunny afternoon, Eleanor and Lillian stood together on the high marble steps of the courthouse. Lillian was filming a final report on a new law, and Eleanor stood by her side, looking proud and dignified. They had taken a scary and unfair moment and turned it into a historic victory for justice. As they walked down the steps toward their car, Eleanor felt a sense of peace. She had defended the law one last time, not from behind the desk, but by standing. The story of the $3 million traffic stop was over, but the change it brought to the